There's a specific kind of political move that almost never gets recognized for what it is when it happens. Not the dramatic ones, not the sanctions, the summits, the press conferences with flags behind them. I'm talking about the moves that wear a costume, that look like ceremonies, that are covered by the sports desk instead of the foreign desk. On May 24, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked into Aberdeen Pavilion in Ottawa, stood next to FIFA President Gianni Infantino, and lifted the FIFA World Cup trophy above his head. The cameras loved it. The crowd cheered. The kids from the Ottawa City Soccer Club got their photos. And almost nobody watching that image understood what they were actually looking at. Let me give you the frame first, because without it, this whole story looks like a sports segment. 5 months before Carney lifted that trophy in Ottawa, Infantino stood on the stage at the Kennedy Center in Washington and handed Trump a FIFA Peace Prize. Same man, same organization, two completely different stages. And in between those two moments, between Trump's Peace Prize and Carney's trophy, the United States placed a 50% tariff on Canadian steel, a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum, a 50% tariff on Canadian copper, a 25% tariff on Canadian autos and auto parts, a 10% tariff on softwood lumber. These aren't threats, they aren't headlines. They are the actual verified current rates hitting Canadian industries as you watch this video. So when you see Carney smiling for the cameras with a soccer trophy, and you remember Trump smiling for the cameras with a Peace Prize, you're not looking at two politicians doing photo ops. You're looking at two leaders standing on the same global stage with two entirely different answers to the same question. What does North America stand for in 2026? And the world is watching both answers very carefully. Before we go further, I want to put two numbers in front of you. Hold both of them. $1.07 billion. That's what Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer confirms Canadian governments will spend to co-host this World Cup. About $82 million per game hosted on Canadian soil. $3.8 billion. That's what FIFA's own economic impact assessment, conducted by Deloitte Canada, projects the tournament will generate back into the Canadian economy. Every Canadian dollar spent on tournament preparations is estimated to produce $1.09 in GDP. That's a positive return on day one. And the breakdown matters. $2 billion added directly to Canadian GDP, $1.3 billion in labor income, $700 million in government revenue, 24,100 jobs created or sustained across the country. In British Columbia alone, hosting 7 matches at BC Place, the projected economic output is $1.7 billion. In Ontario, 6 matches at BMO Field, $1.3 billion in output. For an economy currently bleeding from tariff wounds on its most critical export sectors, those numbers aren't just projections, they're oxygen. But here's what's important to understand. Those numbers are the visible part, the part that fits on a government press release, the part that gets cited in parliamentary debates. The invisible part, the diplomatic repositioning, the brand recalibration, the strategic messaging delivered to 48 nations walking through Canadian cities, that part doesn't appear on any spreadsheet. And that part may be worth considerably more than the $3.8 billion anyone can actually measure. To understand why this tournament matters strategically, you need to understand the structural problem Carney walked into when he took office. Canada's economy has been wired into a single artery for over 3 decades. Roughly 70 to 75% of everything Canada exports goes to one country, one buyer, one relationship, one political mood. When that one country places a 50% tariff on your steel, you don't just lose a trade argument. You lose the illusion that you had an independent economic policy. In the first place, what you actually had was a borrowed one. Carney knows this better than almost anyone in Canadian politics. The man ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis. He ran the Bank of England through Brexit, a situation where an entire country woke up one morning and discovered its economic future had been decided by a vote it couldn't fully control. He knows what structural dependency looks like from the inside. He knows what it costs. And he knows, with the precision of a central banker, exactly what it takes to dismantle it. The phrase he's repeated publicly since taking office is deliberate. From reliance to resilience. That's not a campaign slogan. That's a policy architecture compressed into 4 words. Here's where I want to slow down because the past 12 months of Canadian foreign policy contain a series of moves that were covered in fragments, when they were covered at all. Laid end to end, they tell a completely different story than the one most people think they're watching. Move 1. June 2025. Canada and the European Union announced the new EU-Canada Strategic Partnership of the Future, a framework covering trade, technology, energy, and security. Move 2. February 14, 2026. Canada becomes the first non-European country in history to join the EU's Security Action for Europe, the SAFE initiative, a €150 billion EU defense loan facility designed to support large-scale joint procurement, ammunition, missiles, drones, artillery. Canadian manufacturers now have direct access to that market. Move 3. May 4, 2026. Carney travels to Yerevan, Armenia, and becomes the first non-European leader ever admitted to the European Political Community Summit, a gathering of 48 European heads of state. He holds bilateral meetings with the leaders of France, Italy, Poland, Spain, Ukraine, Armenia, the European Council, the European Commission, and the European Parliament. 0 Americans in the room, 1 Canadian at the table. When asked about it in Yerevan, Carney said something that deserves more attention than it received. We're the most European of non-European countries. There are many ways we can work together. The EU's bilateral trade with Canada hit $178.6 billion in 2025. The EU is now Canada's second-largest trading partner in goods and services. And then, May 24th. The World Cup trophy in Ottawa. Now look at the sequence again. EU Strategic Partnership, Safe Defense Initiative, European Political Community Summit, World Cup hosting. 3 platforms, 1 message. Canada is open. Canada is stable. Canada is predictable. We are not the country currently threatening to make you the 51st state. That's not coincidence. That's choreography. Here's the thing most sports coverage completely misses about a World Cup. The matches last 90 minutes. The impressions last a generation. 48 nations are sending teams to this tournament. They are also sending journalists, officials, investors, coaches, family members, business executives, people who will walk through Toronto and Vancouver, use public transit, stay in hotels, eat in restaurants, meet Canadians, and form judgments. Not about soccer, about Canada. About whether this is a country they want to invest in, whether this is a place they want to send a regional headquarters, whether this is somewhere they'd like to study, to hold a conference, to sign a trade deal. Carney understands that the real return on this tournament is not in the Deloitte report. It's in the decisions made in boardrooms and government offices 12 to 36 months from now, by people who were here and felt something. And here's where the competitive advantage becomes real. And it's not one Carney manufactured. It was handed to him by the political climate south of the border. Travel industry data from the past several months tells a story that nobody on either side of this border particularly wants to say out loud. International fans, particularly from Europe, Asia, and South America, are making a calculation before they book their World Cup travel. They're comparing entry requirements, border environments, and what analysts are now calling travel predictability. Canada's IRCC launched early visitor application campaigns beginning in December 2025, months ahead of the tournament, specifically to process the anticipated surge of fans wanting simple, fast, reliable entry. The result, according to multiple travel industry analysts, is that Canada is consolidating a role not just as a co-host, but as the preferred gateway, the entry point that international fans choose when they want fewer variables in their travel plan. Early data suggests more World Cup fans are targeting Canada for simpler, smoother trips, as visa concerns and complex logistics cloud U.S. entry plans for many overseas visitors. If a fan's team has a match in the United States and a match in either Mexico or Canada, they may prefer the latter option due to the hurdles in place to get into the U.S. and the general global sentiment surrounding the country. Trump pledged at a White House briefing in May 2025 that visitors would have a seamless experience at the U.S. border. That promise runs directly against projections showing foreign traveler arrivals in the U.S. expected to decline by 5.1% in 2025, before the tournament even begins. I want to be fair about this. The American hosting footprint is enormous. 11 U.S. cities, the final at MetLife Stadium. The operational machinery the U.S. has built around this tournament is real. TSA coordination, State Department visa processing task forces, dedicated DHS World Cup units. None of that should be dismissed. But operational infrastructure does not shape global perception. Political climate does. And right now, those two things are pulling in opposite directions on the American side of this border. Canada didn't engineer that gap, but Carney clearly intends to use it. Let me come back to the economic reality for a moment, because it gives the diplomatic play its full weight. Canada's steel and aluminum industry sends roughly 90% of its exports to the United States. When you build a 50% wall around that market, you're not negotiating. You're compressing an entire industrial sector into an impossible cost structure. And here's what most reporting leaves out about how tariffs actually work. Tariffs are not paid by the exporting country. They are collected at the U.S. border, which means American importers pay them, which means American manufacturers pay more for the Canadian aluminum in their cars, the Canadian steel in their appliances, the Canadian softwood in their construction projects. The Federal Reserve's own internal modeling on tariff pass-through suggests roughly 60 to 80% of those costs land on domestic American buyers within 12 months. Several major U.S. manufacturing associations have been quietly lobbying against further escalation, even as the public messaging stays loud. Because the businesses that rely on Canadian inputs are doing the math, and the math doesn't work. For Canada, the tariff pressure is genuinely painful. The Bank of Canada's modeling suggests sustained tariff pressure at current levels could add between 3 and 7% to manufacturing input costs over a 6-month window. But pain has a way of accelerating decisions that should have been made earlier. And what you're watching right now, the EU partnerships, the SAFE initiative, the Yerevan summit, the World Cup positioning, is what strategic diversification looks like when the pressure finally becomes impossible to ignore. There's a precedent worth studying here. When Mexico faced concentrated tariff pressure during the first Trump administration, it did something most people overlooked at the time. It didn't just retaliate symmetrically. It accelerated trade negotiations with the European Union, Japan, and the Pacific Rim. Over a 5-year window, that produced a measurable reduction in single market exposure. Mexican exporters had options the next time pressure arrived. Canada is following a version of that same blueprint, but with advantages Mexico didn't have. A national carbon pricing structure that aligns with the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which penalizes imports from countries without it. When European buyers have to choose between Canadian aluminum and aluminum from countries without carbon pricing, the Canadian product clears the border cleaner. That's not luck. That's policy alignment paying off. Access to the safe defense procurement market, the first non-European country ever admitted. A relationship with the European political community that no other non-European nation currently holds. And a World Cup hosting role that delivers all of that messaging to a global audience, at exactly the moment Canada needs the world to see it. The question isn't whether Canada can diversify. The question is whether it can do it fast enough to meaningfully reduce the leverage Washington has before the next round of pressure arrives. I want to be clear about what I'm watching as this tournament unfolds. First, fan distribution data. Once travel bookings finalize and the tournament begins, we'll see hard numbers on how international fans actually distributed themselves between Canadian and American cities. If the gap between booked Canada and booked US is meaningfully wider than the match ratio suggests, it confirms a perceptual shift that is much larger than one tournament. Second, non-US export trajectory. Canada's stated goal is to double non-US exports over a decade. The current pace of EU trade growth, $178.6 billion in bilateral trade in 2025, up substantially from prior years, will tell us whether that target is realistic inside 10 years or needs 20. Third, Washington's tariff behavior. The Trump administration's choices on trade pressure over the next 12 months will determine whether this is a negotiating tactic being used against a specific set of Canadian industries or a structural feature of the bilateral relationship going forward. If it's a tactic, expect softening as American manufacturing lobbies grow louder. If it's structural, expect Canada's diversification pace to accelerate beyond anything currently visible. Those three data streams will tell us far more about the future of North America's economic architecture than any single summit, speech, or press conference. Here is what the next 4 weeks, from Canada's opening match against Bosnia and Herzegovina in Toronto on June 12th through the final whistle on July 19th, actually represent. Not a soccer tournament, a demonstration. A demonstration that a country of 40 million people, running a fraction of the economic size of its southern neighbor, can navigate a hostile trade environment, build new strategic partnerships on 3 continents, attract the world's attention, and do it all while making it look like a celebration. The $755 million Carney committed to soccer infrastructure, $660 million of it earmarked specifically for youth and grassroots programs, means the kids in that photo with Carney at Lansdowne Park are going to grow up in a country whose national soccer system was permanently transformed by this moment. That's the long game. Not the trophy Carney lifted for the cameras, but what that trophy represents to the 48 nations watching from the stands, to the European investors now recalibrating their risk maps, to the Asian trade partners looking for stable entry points into North American markets, and to every government quietly deciding whether the world's rules are still being written in Washington or somewhere else. Empires don't lose their influence in a single moment. They lose it in a series of moments that individually look like ceremonies, sports events, summits, photo opportunities, until one day someone adds them up. Pay attention to the count.